So I'll tell you what we're going to see, folks. First of all, thanks for coming. This is a presentation that I did last month for the Canadian Society, and I wanted to make sure that you had the benefit of it, because I've done it succinctly, or tried to on the screen. I have a flash drive, and I was going to do it live if I needed to, okay, here as well. And I'm happy to take questions as we go. This is a story of why, which is not a well-known story. It's based on information that I obtained from confidential archive material that has now been declassified. And for about 25 minutes in the talk, I will talk about history. Then I'm going to talk about stamp stuff. Then I'm going to talk about the archives. You need to understand the history in order to understand the stamps. You need to understand the history and the stamps in order to appreciate the archival material. The bottom line of the presentation is that Canada deliberately did not recognize the State of Israel for a number of reasons, and specifically there are express references in archival material that indicate that it wouldn't accept references to the State of Israel at all until a much later time in 1948. There were political reasons, there were personal reasons, which will come out as we look at the material. It's a fascinating area. How I got onto it, I will tell you as I go on the screen, because you always wonder how people get into this stuff, and you'll learn very quickly about why. So thank you for coming, and we'll see if this works. If it does, we'll carry on.
Something that works, if that works, it's a good thing. Yeah, perfect. Okay, and I'm going to put it on right there to the PowerPoint presentation.
Go down to the bottom
so
right
what I'm going to be speaking
wall
about
volume,
today
see if that helps.
is a topic that I've termed politics and postal circulars. This is really a cross between postal history, social history, actual history, and I'm going to be speaking about the evolution of postal relations between Canada and the State of Israel in 1948. And in particular, I'm going to be addressing the role of the Liberal Party and specifically the Undersecretary of External Affairs at the time, Lester Pearson, who became the Secretary of External Affairs, ultimately a Prime Minister of Canada in the 1960s. Why am I doing this presentation, as some people have asked me? Well, I started off on a very innocent basis, trying to do some postal history work, and you'll see an envelope in front of you that's dated December the 27th, or it's postmarked December 27th, 1948, out of Montreal, Canada, and it refers to an addressee, Mrs. Daltrop, likely a relative of the renowned family lawyer in Vancouver, Paul Daltrop. But this was an envelope from 1948, and it's got 25 cents Canadian postage, and you see over on the left side it's got some censorship tape, but in and of itself, you know, it might not look very distinct. You know, it might be a postal history item that some of you would look at and go, that's very nice, but it's for someone else, not for me. And I was looking, given that I had this envelope, for the appropriate postal rate at the time, which I believe to be 25-cent airmail rate, single weight letter. And then I got into a mystery, because I started looking for the appropriate literature in order to corroborate the postal rate. And I went to look for the 1947 Canada Postal Guide. And when I looked in this book, which was for 1947, it started talking about the State of Israel, which I knew had been founded on May the 14th, 1948. So therefore I thought, something's wrong in this book. And then I went further into the book, and I saw that there were references to partial posts going to the State of Israel, you know, which occurred early 1949, and there were references to Palestine in the book. And I thought, something's just not right here, because unless somebody had the foresight in 1947 to be talking about postal relations between Canada and the State of Israel in 1947, when in fact events occurred much later, then something seemingly was wrong. So I found out the 1947 Canadian Postal Guide had been reprinted in 1949, and that there didn't appear to be the 1948 guide. And this 1947 Postal Guide is talking about postal rates to Israel. And as I mentioned, the state hadn't yet been founded. So I went looking for more information, and I found a postal circular that was put out on a weekly basis by the post office in Canada. And it went to all postmasters and post offices across Canada. And I found out that I was right, that the appropriate postal rate was 25 cents for that particular envelope that I showed you. However, what really piqued my interest were some of the mysteries that I found in these books, talking about the State of Israel when the State of Israel didn't exist. So I went and looked at the postal circular, which you have on your screen, and I hope all of you see it. And the English version is on the left, or a translated version is on the left, and on the right there's the French version. And if you look in the French version, it talks about service de dépêche pour la Palestine, or translated into the English, mail service to Palestine. And looking at the bottom of the circular, you see it's the 7th of August, 1948. And again, I'm finding this really quizzical, because the State of Israel was declared on May 14, 1948. So why is Canada in a postal circular talking about mail for Palestine and mail service to Palestine? Didn't Canada recognize the State of Israel on May 14, 1948? I thought to myself. So these simple inquiries that I was making gave rise to further questions. The circular talked about mail service to Palestine. How was I to reconcile some of the things that I was finding? And using my legal brain, I said there had to be an underlying story, a deep story that some of us may not have known about, just looking at this information. So I thought to myself, where will I go for some of these answers? And I went looking in the Library and Archives Canada for some of the answers. And it took me 2 years in order to come up with some answers, but I found through my diligence and my inquiries some secret and confidential materials that gave way to some answers that led me to a broader view of the historical relationships between Canada and Israel between 1948 and 1950. And this fascinating file of 148 pages that was marked secret and confidential from the Department of External Affairs spoke of Canada's foreign policy position and how Canada impacted the attempts by Israel to normalize its postal relations and to establish a membership in the Universal Postal Union, which some of you may or may not know is the organization which, amongst other things, facilitates the transfer of mail between various countries in a very easy fashion, so that fees aren't necessarily charged between countries when mail is sent back and forth between them.
Actually have to talk now.
You don't have to.
No, hang on. The internet.
And welcome to May's Stamp Talk, or Stamp Talks. Thank you for showing up.
I know how to drag this when I have to. And I don't want you to go through that all again.
sometimes the wireless connection will interrupt and you have to click on the little, accept and get logged back on. It might have logged off. It does that.
In order to suit foreign policy initiatives,
Thanks.
both
All right, hold on.
Canadian initiatives and the initiatives of its ally
when I come back.
and mother country. I'd like to acknowledge people and books and information. I obviously had access to a 148-page dossier from the Department of External Affairs that I obtained from the Library and Archives Canada. And also, whenever you do study of postal history, it's always relevant and important to look at other texts that deal with the area in which you're studying. And two extraordinary books, one by David Murkison, another from Zach Kay, about the historical relationships, the political relationships between Canada and Israel during this relevant period were outstanding. And thank you to Professor Richard Menkes for bringing these books to my attention because they did prove very useful in the study of this area and really shed light on the materials from the archives. I contacted the Universal Postal Union for information. I was grateful to my friend Bill McConan for providing me with the Canada Postal Guides that were relevant, the Vincent Green Research Foundation in Toronto for providing me with the postal circulars. And I had written some articles, or at least one article on this area in past in the Canadian Philatelist, but other books were of relevance that I list here from different authors. Israeli authors, Canadian authors, English authors, writing about the postal history between Israel and other states, including Canada. In addition, and what's going to be relevant in this presentation, is the history between the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and the State of Israel, or Palestine as it became, or it was known for a lengthy period of time in Great Britain, the United Kingdom, is very relevant. And a couple of very interesting articles were written on the strained relations between Britain and Israel for a 2-year period. Finally, there's some other articles that were very interesting, some master's theses, doctoral theses that were written on some of the players that are involved in this area. So what are your takeaways from this presentation if I lose you part of the way in this presentation? Canadian foreign policy and politics shaped the development of postal relations between Canada and the State of Israel. You'll see from the censored material I'm going to show you how Canada wouldn't acknowledge the existence of the State of Israel throughout 1948, and in particular in various postal documents, in order to suit foreign policy initiatives, both Canadian initiatives and the initiatives of its ally and mother country, so to speak, Great Britain. 3 of Canada's prime ministers, you will see, King, Pearson, Saint Laurent. King was the current prime minister in 1948, giving way to Saint Laurent. Ultimately, Pearson became a prime minister in the country. They all played roles in postal relations and postal policies towards the State of Israel. And Zach Kay, in his outstanding book, calls this the diplomacy of prudence, or the politics of non-commitment that Canada displayed generally in the period towards foreign policy affairs, but also in developing its postal relations with the State of Israel. Canada played a very direct role in the delayed entry of Israel into the Universal Postal Union and into the United Nations in 1948 and 49. Some of you may not know that Canada had a seat on the UN Security Council in late 1948 and did not support Israel at that time in its entry in late 48 into the United Nations. So it's not a wonder when we look at the 2010 stamp that was issued by the joint countries that the two countries came to the conclusion that their friendship really started in 1950 and not in 1948. And that's why the stamp was issued in 2010, and that's why the 60 years is the number of years that's referenced on the stamps. You'll see as we go along that the language in postal circulars was engineered by senior politicians in Canada and the United Kingdom to reflect foreign policy positions. Mail service to Transjordan, mail service to Israel, Palestine, Arab-occupied lands in Transjordan. However you want to frame the occupation or the relationship between the inhabitants and the land that was occupied, those postal relations were clearly affected by political and military factors. The Red Cross came to Canada and said, can we somehow deliver mail to prisoners of war in Arab-occupied areas or Jewish-occupied areas in Palestine? And Canada said, no, we don't need your help in the circumstances in 1948. And the file from External Affairs details at some length the relationship between the Red Cross and Canada in this regard. And finally, the delay of Israel's entry into the Universal Postal Union, which didn't occur until late December 1949, required Israel to conclude various postal agreements with countries around the world in order to have mail to and from Israel transported to these various countries. I believe, Israel had agreements with possibly up to 75, 100 countries in order to have its mail transported. And that was something that progressed between 1948 and 49. So in order to best appreciate the material we're going to look at from the from the Department of External Affairs materials, you need to appreciate the historical background and the context for the presentation. And first of all, we need to know who the players were. And Mackenzie King, William Lyon Mackenzie King, the longest serving Prime Minister in Canadian history, was the Prime Minister until the fall of 1948, and in fact was also the Minister for External Affairs until the fall of 1946. In late 46 and 47, his French lieutenant, Louis Saint Laurent, was appointed as the Minister of External Affairs, and under Saint Laurent, Lester Pearson, previously the ambassador to the United States for Canada, was appointed as Saint Laurent's undersecretary. And no presentation about stamps would be possible without showing stamps. And we have the three prime ministers, King, Saint Laurent, and Pearson, shown on postage. They're also shown on other stamps, but here's three stamps just to recognize the dramatis personae. Now here's a picture of William Lyon Mackenzie King. As I mentioned, served as the longest standing Canadian Prime Minister, non-consecutive terms. To give you, again, a face to a name. Here's Saint Laurent, Minister of Justice at one point in time, Secretary of State for External Affairs. And unlike King, who was a person who really didn't want to have Canada mix very much in foreign affairs, Saint Laurent was an enthusiastic proponent for Canada joining NATO in 1949 to spread the, quotes, fight against communist ideology, and he also was supportive of different relations with the United States. And there's the Canadian Lieutenant Lester Pearson, as I mentioned previously, the ambassador to the United States, Secretary for External Affairs under King and Saint Laurent. Now these people couldn't have done their work in this presentation without the help of different people. So we see different people in external affairs whom we're going to see referred to in the archival material coming to the fore. A man who died very young, R.G. Riddell, delegate to the UN in 1950, he died in 51 in an accident, as I believe, and he was a historian who worked in external affairs. An extraordinary person, Elizabeth McCallum, who was at odds with Pearson and certain other members of the Department of External Affairs. She was a diplomat, a scholar. She was born in the Ottoman Empire, for example, and she wrote extensively on matters in the Middle East. You'll see George Ignatieff referred to, a man who is known to some of you at later stages of his life, but he joined the Department of External Affairs and had a presence at the United Nations. Escott Reed was a very important civil servant. He served as the Undersecretary of State for External Affairs after Pearson became the Secretary of State for External Affairs. We had a gentleman named Leon Mayrand who worked on the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. He's referred to in the materials. Norman Robertson, who was Canada's High Commissioner in London. He was a diplomat extraordinaire who served the Liberal government for many years. All of these people became known in other spheres in connection with the university, teaching appointments, but at this time their careers were on the rise or in midstream, and that's why I'm referring to them. We don't really see this man, General MacNaughton, referred to in the External Affairs materials expressly, but he was Canada's representative in the United Nations and was on the Security Council late 1948 when Canada was there. He was a career diplomat and soldier. A man whom we'll see referred to is a gentleman named E.R. Hopkins, who was the legal advisor to the Department of External Affairs, and another gentleman named A.A. Day, who drafted a lot of material for Pearson and Riddell in this file. So in order to really look at the historical material, you need to appreciate that all of this history was the product of the actions of many people. So, and what was Canada's position and relationship with different players? Well, with Great Britain, Canada was very loyal to Great Britain because of Prime Minister King. And as some people have written, Canada was always blindly loyal to the views of Great Britain in early 1948, and that dissipated as King ceased to be Prime Minister in the fall, late summer of 1948, when Saint Laurent became the leader of the Liberals. But Canada had a different relationship with the United States. It was close. It was interested in, Canada was interested in cultivating this relationship, but Britain always came first. Canada was assisted in becoming a member of the UN Security Council by the United States. Some would suggest to further the interests of the United States on that council at the United Nations. But Canada did have a close relationship, and part of the politics of non-commitment, part of the diplomacy of prudence, was that Canada had to balance the relationship between Canada and the United States, and you will see that reflected in the drafting of postal circulars with Israel in short order. Now, what was the foreign policy of the Liberal government? Well, there were many different policies. Canada attempted to balance the relations, as I mentioned. Canada was interested in supporting the creation of NATO. It was interested in the US-sponsored Marshall Plan for aid to European countries, but there was still deference to British policies about Palestine. And what was Canada's position on Palestine and Jewish statehood? Well, there had been a history in the Liberal Party of non-immigration to Canada. You know, King had opposed Jewish immigration in part with Fred Blair, amongst others, you know, earlier on in his term as Prime Minister. But King was very much in favor of Britain's opposition to the creation of a Jewish state. But there was conflict as well in the Department of External Affairs between the various people who were there, including Elizabeth McCallum, who I referred to, because she believed that there would never be cooperation between the Jews and the Arabs, and there would be turmoil and violence that would occur ultimately if Britain withdrew from its mandate, which had been set up by the League of Nations, to which I'll refer to right now. Now, the British mandate over Palestine, those of you will remember that in First World War, you will remember from your studies, not necessarily remember from being there, but in World War I, the Ottoman Empire opposed the alliance that consisted of Britain, France, and other countries. The Ottoman Empire was the loser. As a result of the conflict, Britain was given a mandate by the League of Nations to administer territory in the Palestine area. France was also given a mandate over areas such as Lebanon, and the League of Nations approved the mandate in 1922, and Britain set up its own postal system inside Palestine. It was British, it was administered by the British, there were stamps that were issued. Historically, conflict existed between Arabs and Jews even before World War I. It escalated throughout the war and after World War II to the point where armed conflict arose, and it was the object of various organizations, various countries, to try to mediate or resolve that conflict. So in 1947, we have the UN, the United Nations, which obviously had taken over from the League of Nations after 1945 and its establishment. It tried to create a committee in order to try to resolve the conflict within Palestine. Here is a first day cover of a stamp that was issued by Israel to commemorate the creation of the UN Partition Plan in 1947 and the UN Special Committee on Palestine. That's what UNSCOP stands for. And this committee, this UNSCOP, was created to investigate the cause of conflict to find some solution. May of 1947. The committee reported out in September of 1947, and Canada was represented on that committee by former former Justice of the Supreme Court, Ivan Rand. And you will see on stamps that you have in front of you, these stamps that were issued by the Jewish National Fund, a map of the partition plan that was set out by UNSCOP in late 1947. And the map to the left of those labels or stamps, they also show the territory that was to be a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, there were votes that were taken, and some of you may have seen the movie Exodus, and you would have seen the vote for the partition of Palestine, and Canada was one of the 33 countries that voted in favor of the partition plan, even though the United Kingdom was pressuring various Commonwealth countries, including Canada, not to vote in favor of the partition plan. Now, what about the situation in Great Britain and the United States at that time? Well, the leader in Great Britain succeeding Churchill was Clement Attlee, who was a politician who led the Labour Party. And he and his sidekick, Ernest Bevin, who was a statesman, trade union leader, Labour politician, together with Bevin as foreign secretary, were in favor of, or were not in favor of, the creation of a Jewish state. Ultimately, however, Great Britain was interested in opposing communism and the creation of NATO, and as a result, Great Britain's position towards the creation of a Jewish state mollified as time went on in order to please its partners in these endeavors. Now, in terms of its attitude to Palestine, 1947 and 48, Great Britain really didn't want to accept the creation of a Jewish state. It had economic relationships with the Arab states in the region, particularly because of the oil interests that were there at the time. Great Britain's position with respect to the creation of a Jewish state and the support of one changed as the Russian blockade in Berlin occurred in June of 1948. But what Great Britain was very interested in trying to achieve was to have legal recognition extended to Transjordan, which had become a country, as a state, sovereign state in 1946. And it wanted Transjordan to become a member of the United Nations, which the United States hadn't necessarily agreed to support. So all of this debate about a Jewish state, Arab states, Palestine, everything else was tied heavily into politics, into economics, and the support by one or more countries of other countries within the region for political and economic reasons. Now, in the United States, we had Harry Truman, who was the president following the death of Franklin Roosevelt. He implemented the Marshall Plan to support the economy of Western Europe, and he wanted to contain communism. At the time, he wanted the creation of NATO. And one of the things to remember is he was a member of the Democratic Party, which supported the creation of a Jewish state as part of its platform. Now there's all your history. You now know a lot of different things, and you've heard a lot of things which you may have learned about at school or otherwise. And now I'm going to talk about some postal relations between Canada and Palestine before 1948. And they were humdrum. They were normal postal relations. Remember, Great Britain was administering or involved in the postal operations of Palestine, given the fact that Palestine was a mandate of Great Britain. So postal rates from Canada were set out in postal guides, in weekly sheets, The airmail rate in 1946 was 25 cents, just like it was on the envelope that I showed you earlier, the Daltrop envelope that we started off with at the time. Registered mail, if you wanted to send a registered letter from Canada to Great Britain, or if you wanted to send airmail, typically service routed through Great Britain. So if mail service was to shut down between Palestine and Great Britain, then mail service between Canada and Palestine would also shut down, unless mail could somehow be routed through the United States. So here are some examples of mail that occurred in 1948. A 15-cent air letter going to the well-known Dr. Bernard Joseph in Jerusalem, in Palestine. There's no arrival postmark, but that went through the ordinary course. A letter from Montreal to Tel Aviv with the appropriate 25-cent airmail rate going from Montreal to Tel Aviv. Now, what about the disintegration of postal relations with Palestine and the withdrawal of Great Britain from the formerly League of Nations mandate, then UN mandate over Palestine? Well, Great Britain gave notice to the United Nations that the mandate would end on May the 15th of 1948, and it wrote to the Universal Postal Union saying, by the way, I don't know how mail's going to get to and from Palestine after we're gone, but we're just giving you notice that somebody better step in. You, the Universal Postal Union, the United States, some other country, to somehow have mail administered. Now, what was the role of the Universal Postal Union, which had been established back in 1874 and became known as the Universal Postal Union after a short period of time? By the way, Canada joined the Universal Postal Union in 1878. So a very important organization for Canada, for Great Britain, and countries around the world. Well, the Universal Postal Union put out different bulletins to all of its member countries, of which there were quite a few. And it told them that mail service was slowly to be suspended to and from Palestine. And on March the 5th, there was a circular that came out that told the member countries that Palestine, the postal administration there, could not undertake responsibility for mail reaching Palestine after certain dates because there was conflict, there was strife that was going on. Buildings were being blown up, post roads were being disrupted. So these are the types of circulars that were issued by the Universal Postal Union. And you'll see in the heading, Palestine suspension, temporary suspension of service of valeur déclarée, which is insured mail. You'll see that the bulletins come out of Bern, Switzerland. This is January 6, 1948. Here's another original bulletin out of the Universal Postal Union, January 16, 1948, announcing that certain services again were being disrupted. Another bulletin in March of 1948 announcing that Britain had given notice regarding the termination of its mandate, its postal services. And you will see here that there were dates for the cessation of certain mail services. For parcels, March 15, for surface mail, April 15, and for airmail or other parcels that were going in, they would be April 15. Airmail was to likely cease around April 15, but possibly closer to the end of the mandate on May 15. Other circulars that the Universal Postal Union put out, they expressed in March and April concern about the disruption of mail. And here are those circulars once again. Palestine communications about the execution and responsibility of postal service. April of 1948, again warning about the soon-to-be elimination of mail services in Palestine or with Palestine. So finally, as the months wore on and with all these warnings that were occurring, finally, mail service breaks down and it's eliminated. March 17th, Britain says in its own circulars that anyone who sends mail by surface, land or sea to Palestine won't be able to do it after March 25th. In Palestine itself, the post office in Jerusalem, the General Post Office, was announcing that there would be termination of services. And here's an example of, not very well photocopied by me, of the circular out of Great Britain announcing the cessation of mail services between Palestine and Great Britain. And here are the postal circulars in Jerusalem that were issued by the Department of Posts and Telegraphs in Palestine, again announcing the dates for termination of services. So what the British were intending to do is slowly cut off services to the point where somebody might step in, but they basically said to people, you won't get mail into Palestine, you won't get mail out of Palestine. So for those of you who are stamp collectors who are watching this presentation, and thank you for coming, you will see surface mail that no longer could reach Palestine on April the 8th because there was no more surface mail. And you see these legends that are on the mail that say service suspended. Then more circulars start coming out, and there's announcements about airmail that is no longer going to occur. The airport in Lida, known today as Lod in Palestine, was shut down April the 24th. And then in Britain, no airmail that was not registered, let alone registered for transport to Palestine, would be accepted. And there were circulars that were coming out indicating that there would be no registered airmail coming out of Great Britain as of April the 25th. So you could see that things were becoming grim. And here are some examples of some of the last mail that was coming out of Palestine, out to Great Britain, out to the United Kingdom. Here's a letter that came out on the 18th of April, commercial mail out of Haifa. There's another letter going to London from a dental surgeon. I hope he wasn't trying to collect his bill from someone. But there it is on April the 22nd. Remember, the airport's closing down April the 24th. Here's mail that was supposed to go by airmail, but never made it because it was postmarked April the 26th. There's the postmark right there. I'm showing you with the arrow. So mail that was otherwise shut down by air generally traveled out of by sea out of Haifa. And finally, April the 28th, Britain says no more civilian postal service to Palestine. So here's what happened if you tried to take a letter to the post office in Great Britain. April the 30th, 1948, you couldn't send it to Tel Aviv. Here was some commercial mail, no service, returned to sender. And by the way, these are hard pieces to find for those of you who are wondering when you see no service mail, interrupted mail service. Here's one going out of Great Britain to Netanya in Palestine. Different kinds of legends, but nonetheless, no service, undelivered, returned to sender. Here is some censorship tape over on the side that would otherwise did reflect the censoring of the mail that would otherwise go. So what kind of postal operations did exist in Palestine between May the 2nd and May the 15th? Remember, May the 15th was the end of the mandate, that was created by the League of Nations. May the 2nd, the beginning of the provisional Jewish government in Palestine, which also was known as Minhelet Ha'am, the Council of the People. And they created different labels, different stamps. There were postal circulars that were created by the provisional government in Palestine. I won't get into them, but they talked about how mail could be sent within Palestine or perhaps out of Palestine. But remember, mail service wasn't going anywhere for the most part except by sea or maybe by land, or if somebody would take a letter for you on a plane. But there weren't planes going out unless you got to a different country. So sea mail left Haifa in certain circumstances. Here's an example of some sea mail going to London. It's dated May the 14th, postmark May the 14th, 1948. Here are some Jewish National Fund labels that were used as stamps, which, by the way, the Universal Postal Union did not permit. Here were postmarks that the Universal Postal Union did not permit because they're only in one language, in Hebrew, and they're supposed to be in one of the universal languages that the Universal Postal Union was supportive of. So what was Canada's response at the time? And this is where it gets really interesting, and these are the backgrounds where we get into, ultimately, the Library of and Archives materials from the Department of External Affairs. So Canada issued bulletins on April the 24th and May the 1st saying, if you want to send mail to Palestine, you're going to be out of luck. And here is the Canadian circular in French talking about the suspension of service of registered mail for Palestine in April of 1948. Here's a beautiful piece of mail coming from the Royal Bank of Canada, commercial mail going to Jerusalem, Palestine. And there was the right postage. You know, I call it the Doltrop postage rate, the 25% airmail rate. Unfortunately, there was no service, so it had to go back to the Royal Bank. But when mail gets sent back, postage dues were put on. These were the old postage dues, beautifully done in the 1940s. And it doesn't get back to the sender in the circumstances, and it goes to the dead letter office in Montreal. Here's some other mail that reflects the elimination of service from Canada. Here's a letter from Montreal. It doesn't even have the right amount of postage on it. And the postmaster assesses postage due, but can't send it anywhere, can't send it to Tel Aviv, the airport's closed, and it goes back to the sender. However, it ends up in the dead letter office. Then, May the 1st, no mail goes to Palestine from Canada, except mail for British Armed Forces and the police. Another example of a beautiful piece, 25-cent airmail rate, service was suspended. Return it to the sender, Tillsonburg, Ontario. And this is the postmark for return of the piece, first sent May the 17th, comes back on May the 25th. So we see there's no mail service to and from Palestine, to Great Britain, to and from Palestine in Canada. So what's Israel doing in the circumstances? It declared statehood. May the 14th, 1948. Here's Independence Hall in Tel Aviv. Here's the inside of Independence Hall in Tel Aviv, where Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel at the time. And the Arab countries were opposed to the partition of Palestine to begin with from the UNSCOP, from the UN Special Committee on Palestine. They were opposed to the establishment of a separate Jewish state, and they took military action where 5 different Arab legions from different countries marched on into the area of Palestine, and armed conflict continued or began, depending on your view of the circumstances. And at the same time, a provisional government of Israel was established. And why do you need to know this? Well, here's, first of all, the headline from the Palestine Post of May 14, 1948, recognizing the State of Israel. But you see that there was conflict by U.S. recognizes Jewish state. That's very important for this talk, as you will come and see shortly. May 15th, the mandate is terminated, and there's conflict. And the United Nations appoints a mediator, Count Bernadotte, who we'll hear more about as the presentation goes on. And there's conflict in Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs. Military conflict, there are a couple of truces, there are different advances both by the Arabs and the Jews in different areas. But you see that the conflict continues to be ongoing in 1948. And what about the recognition of Israel? You saw in the headline that the U.S. recognized the Jewish state. But to what extent did it recognize it? It extended de facto recognition of the Jewish state. That is, the United States did. It didn't extend legal recognition of the Jewish state until the first election of Israel that occurred on January of 1949. And what's so interesting from a historical perspective, looking backwards, is Israel was first recognized after the United States by Iran, Guatemala, Iceland, Nicaragua, Romania, Uruguay. And the first country to extend legal recognition to Israel was the USSR on May 17, 1948, followed by Nicaragua, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland. And the reason why this slide is very important is because when countries extended legal recognition to the State of Israel, they could conduct postal relations with them. And they did, as we will come to see in a few minutes. But when I talk about de facto recognition, it's provisional recognition of statehood. It's a step towards recognizing a country as a sovereign state, to enter into contracts and into treaties and other agreements, as opposed to jury recognition, legal recognition, which is entry into the United Nations and certain rights and obligations, recognition of the territory that a country has in the circumstances. And for your purposes, what it will impact the whole area of the postal relations is Canada did not factually recognize the State of Israel until December the 24th, 1948. And it didn't extend legal recognition to the State of Israel until May 11th, 1949. That might be shocking to some of you because Canada had voted in favor of the UN partition of Palestine at the end of 1947. But it took months and months, for various reasons we'll see, for Canada to extend de facto and de jure recognition to Israel. The United Kingdom was worse. May 13, 1949 for de facto recognition. There are arguments that de facto recognition was extended in February of 1949. But the United Kingdom didn't extend legal recognition to the State of Israel until April 28, 1950, long after Israel had become a member of the United Nations. Now, what were the postal relations in Israel as of May 16? Israel was issuing stamps. Here are the first stamps of Israel, the Jewish post, the Dor Ivri, the Hebrew coins. There were postal hammers that were created, postmarks. Israel was trying to join the Universal Postal Union because it wanted to establish postal relations with many countries. So in order to do that, who did Israel reach out to? It enters into an agreement for the transmission of airmail with Czechoslovakia, into surface mail, land and sea from the United States. But unless a country had a relationship with the State of Israel, then mail had to go as freight on a third-party carrier, and it couldn't go under the flag of the other country that didn't have recognition or didn't recognize Israel. So airmail to Great Britain had to either be carried by El Al or by British Airways. But if it went on Air France and France hadn't recognized Israel, it had to go as freight mail. Some countries didn't observe this custom and convention and in fact carried the mail more appropriately. Now, no postal service between the UK and Canada. It says here in Hebrew, Ein Sheirut, which means no service between Tel Aviv and Sheffield, England. So how did mail get from the United States to Palestine, to the State of Israel? And what's fascinating is, with the assistance of Czechoslovakian Airlines, and now you understand why, because Czechoslovakia extended recognition to the State of Israel and entered into a postal treaty with the State of Israel, the United States had mail carried with U.S. postage through Czechoslovakian Airlines to Israel. And this service, which was a private service, was called the Palestine Emergency Delivery Service. And it was the only way in which mail could go by airmail from the United States to Israel until late June of 1948. Here's mail, surprisingly, that got from Israel to England. And how did it get there? Via CSR, Czechoslovakian Airlines. So England didn't have a postal relationship with Israel, but Israeli mail was getting into England by way of assistance of the Czechoslovakians. Now, on June the 26th, 1948, the United States enters into airmail service with the State of Israel. It already had surface mail service, and then it entered into airmail service with Israel. So certain things did not go out of the United States. Registered mail didn't go at the time. But you'll see all these post offices in Israel which would be able to receive mail from the United States and could send mail to the United States. And this circular is very important because it became the basis for the circular that Canada entered into ultimately in order to send mail to Palestine. Now, was mail reaching Israel? Was mail from Israel being accepted? We've seen that there was sea mail, there was some air mail that could occur. And here's an example of sea mail going to London with some of these provisional stamps that were coming out of Palestine at the time. The Universal Postal Union, what was it saying at the time? Remember, Israel had been established May 14, 1948. So what did it say? Well, it issued a circular on May the 28th referring to postal service to Palestine. And it announced that Palestine was looking for mail service at the time. But this was the controversial document issued by the Universal Postal Union on June the 1st, 1948. It says, New State of Israel, Service Postale Internationale, basically telling all the members of the Universal Postal Union, there's a new state of Israel out there. Well, if you think that everybody was happy that the Universal Postal Union issued this, you'd be very surprised. And this leads me to the story of Canada's postal relations with Israel after May 14, 1948. Remember, Canada didn't recognize the state of Israel. Prime Minister King wasn't going to go against the wishes of the United Kingdom. Mail service to Palestine had been suspended. We saw that in the circulars that were issued by Canada. No mail service was actually restored between Canada and Palestine until early August of 1948. So here's mail that was sent out of Toronto to Tel Aviv. 5-cent surface mail, service suspended, even though the postage is right. How did mail then go from Canada to Palestine and Israel? Well, private couriers sometimes took mail from Canada if they traveled on Czechoslovakian Airlines, if they traveled on any U.S. airlines. Air France had some limited services that started going to Israel at the time, and mail traveled on Air France. But the United States had the Palestine Emergency Delivery Service until June the 26th. So here is the only recorded example of a letter going from Canada to Palestine, to Rishon LeZion, to the winery in Palestine, the largest winery. And I think the address is very interesting, 100 Adelaide Street West. The law office of which I'm a partner is located in First Canadian Place, which is, roughly the area that's around 100 Adelaide Street West. And that's where that letter came from in July of it left on June the 7th, 1948, and it took 1 month to get to Israel, July the 14th of 1948. So now we get into the archival material, because here we have no mail service, roughly, going out of Canada that's official mail service. We know it's only going to Palestine. And Elizabeth McCallum, who I wrote about before from External Affairs, advises people within External Affairs that mail from Canada is now going to Palestine through the US-based Petty Service, May the 21st, 1948. And in the archival material that I have, there is a memo from Elizabeth McCallum. And you say to yourself, why does External Affairs really care? And I'll tell you why they care. Because on May the 16th, 1948, the Provisional Government of Israel sent a cable to Canada asking Canada to grant official recognition to the State of Israel and its provisional government. And what I've done for you is I've excerpted out from the telegram, or the telex, that was sent by the Provisional Government of Israel, Moshe Shertok, who became Moshe Sharet, ultimately, the President of Israel. And here we have, inform you and would be grateful if you would convey to your government the National Council for the Jewish State, consisting of members of elected representative Jewish bodies in Palestine, which had applied to the United Nations Commission for recognition as a Jewish state in accordance with the Assembly's resolution. And at the end, it basically asks Canada to recognize Israel, to grant official recognition status of Israel and its provisional government. So Canada now has a communication from the State of Israel. But then the next day, on June the 17th, 1948, it becomes even more interesting in the archival material, because the Postmaster General of Israel sends a cable to the Canadian Postmaster General, says, are you going to follow the UPU Circular 110? which talked about the new state of Israel. And are you going to recognize airmail service and surface mail from Haifa and Tel Aviv? And by the way, avoid transit through Arab countries. And here is a picture of the cable that was sent to the Postmaster General in Ottawa from the Postmaster General in Israel, asking for recognition of postal service. Well, now Canada's got a real problem. First, Israel's contacting the Canadian government, and then the Postmaster General of one country is contacting the Canadian Postmaster General. In the meantime, the UPU is going about its business on June 18th and doing another circular about the new state of Israel and talking about all the post offices that you can send mail to in Israel, that mail can be sent from as well in Israel to different countries who are members of the Universal Postal Union who want to recognize Israel. Well, what does the Postmaster General do after he's contacted by Israel? The Postmaster General said, I'm not getting in trouble with the Canadian government, my colleagues. I'm going to go to External Affairs. I'm going to go check with the United Kingdom. What are they doing with respect to mail in Israel? So George Avery, the acting Canadian Postmaster General, writes to Lester Pearson, who's the Undersecretary of State for External Affairs, and he says, is it possible to establish postal communications between Canada and Haifa and Tel Aviv? And Avery said, we're also writing to the UK. Well, all of a sudden, External Affairs gets all excited. And they say, we better go check with our lawyers, because of course that's what everybody does when they want to do something. And they said, would we possibly be extending legal recognition to the state of Israel if we were to conduct mail services with Israel? And they also go and they check with the United Nations people, the External Affairs people there, to ask them what their opinions will be. So Leon Mayrand, who I mentioned earlier in the presentation, asked for a legal opinion from External Affairs whether or not the establishment of services between Canada and Israel would imply recognition. And Mr. Hopkins, who's legal counsel, says the mere recognition of postal services would not imply recognition of Israel. And he says you might even send language to the postal authorities of, quotes, Israel, whatever that was. Hopkins says, but you better go check with Mr. Pearson and Mr. Riddell in External Affairs before you do anything. And here is an excerpt from the legal opinion that was rendered by External Affairs. And they say, you're right in your assumption that the mere resumption of postal services would not imply recognition of Israel. And he talks about the legal precedents of why that would not necessarily be the case. Stemming back to 1934, when the puppet state of Manchukuo was established by the Japanese in Chinese territory. So, as a result, Hopkins says, if you're going to wire the postal authorities of, quotes, Israel, you better tell them that it's purely for the purpose of ensuring the proper conduct of technical services. Well, Leon Mayrand gets this legal opinion, and he's all worried, and he writes to External Affairs, and he says, don't you think that if we somehow extend postal relationships to Israel, it'll create a political difficulty, and Canada will be seen as somehow disrupting the mediation that was going on with Count Bernadotte between the Arabs and the Jews to try to mediate the dispute. And we don't want to be seen to be doing anything that could somehow have Canada thrust into the limelight as somebody who might be upsetting UN mediation activities. So as a result, Mayrand gets very upset, and Mr. Riddell, in handwriting in the archival material, writes to Mr. Mayrand and says, what is wrong with having some letters sent between countries? It might actually make people happy in the circumstances and create some joy in what is otherwise a difficult period of time. So what happens? Department of External Affairs people are all fussed, and they say we better get a sign-off from the big boss. We better we better do a memo to Louis Saint Laurent, who is the Minister of External Affairs, and we say, should we inform the Postmaster General that we would have no objection to the establishment of postal communications with Tel Aviv and Haifa? And here are the important words: provided it is not necessary to refer to either the State of Israel or the provisional government of that state. And you see, I excerpted from the documents in the archival material, that is Louis Saint Laurent's signature with his label underneath saying he agreed with that position. So, what's going on in the meantime? We're now in July of 1948. The Universal Postal Union is sending out more circulars to its members about the new state of Israel, and the number of post offices to which mail can reach is expanded and expanded and expanded. So Louis Saint Laurent, he agrees with the memorandum going to the Postmaster General, tells him you better be careful how you're going to refer to things, and then there's a memo written to the United Kingdom by Canadian External Affairs, by Mr. Day, who works for Lester Pearson. And all inquiries to the United Kingdom always have to go through the High Commissioner in London, who was Mr. Robertson. And he says, can you please tell me how we should handle mail services with Palestine? And what are you guys doing? Are you accepting mail from Palestine? So there was a secret telegram that was prepared for transmission. And Mr. Robertson in the United Kingdom replies, and he said, the UK is furious with the Universal Postal Union, that the Universal Postal Union should never refer to the new state of Israel to all of its members. But, he said, the United Kingdom will make arrangements for correspondence to go to Palestine, but not just the Jewish area of Palestine. And the United Kingdom told Canada that it went to Amman, Jordan, asking whether or not mail could also be transmitted to Arab areas. And if the Arabs agreed with this, the United Kingdom would issue a declaration that there would be mail service to both Arab and Jewish areas of Palestine. The UK also told Canada that they were going to accept mail because in all likelihood mail was already getting into the United Kingdom from Israel, and we've already seen that with examples I've shown you. And mail would also come in through Air France. Well, Mr. Day then says, okay, we know what the UK position is. Now we're going to write to the postmaster and tell him he can go and start trying to get some mail service going with Israel. And Mr. Riddell writes to Mr. Pearson and tells him how of a communication, or how communication should be crafted back to the Postmaster General. So, the Postmaster General starts drafting a postal circular about mail service to Palestine in July of 1948. And it's a progressive exercise starting on July 20th, 1948. And you'll recall that I told you earlier that mail service to Palestine with Canada started on August the 8th, 1948. So between July the 20th of 1948 and August the 8th, we have a whole series of events. What we have, for example, is the following. We have UPU issuing circulars, the United States issuing a circular, all referring to the new state of Israel. The UK is talking about resuming mail service to Palestine, but Canada is worried about recognition of the state of Israel, and it wants to look neutral in the military conflict. So it has to deal with some other stuff. So in early 1948, Israel comes to Canada and says, we want to join the Universal Postal Union. Israel doesn't come directly. They come through the Swiss delegation. So they send the Swiss to go and lobby on their behalf to get into the Universal Postal Union, recognizing that the Universal Postal Union was located in Bern, Switzerland. Canada wanted to be neutral, and they didn't want to get into a fight about whether or not Israel should be invited into the Universal Postal Union. Also, remember at the time, King was the prime minister. King still favored neutrality. King still favored following relationships with the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom at the time was still not very interested in recognizing a Jewish state, so Canada wanted to tread carefully. So, July 20th, 1948, Mr. Turnbull writes to Mr. Pearson saying that maybe we can send mail through the United States and not just through the United Kingdom. And we're going to write to the United States. But in the meantime, what we're going to do is draft a postal circular modeled on what the United States said, but will not refer to the state of Israel. So here was the U.S. circular that I showed you before that referred to limited mail service to the state of Israel. And Canada looks like it's on its way to drafting a circular. And then Canada gets a big shock because the United Kingdom doesn't tell them that it restored postal relations unilaterally with Palestine. And the Postmaster General goes to Lester Pearson and says, I hate to tell you this, but the British have just told us they've resumed mail service to Palestine on a restricted basis, and they're adopting the Universal Postal Union Circular. And here's a copy of the notice that comes from the Postmaster General in the UK to the Postmaster General in Ottawa saying that they're going to enter into mail service with Palestine. And this is a copy of the circular that was issued on July the 23rd by the United Kingdom about airmail service to Palestine and what the rates would be. And notice something that's very interesting here. It says a further announcement about extensions of the service to Arab-controlled areas will be issued as soon as satisfactory local arrangements have been made. Remember what the British told Pearson. They said, we aren't going to do service to Palestine unless we can do it with both the Jews and the Arabs. And then on July the 23rd, the UK comes out unilaterally just dealing with the Jewish areas of Palestine. And here's another copy of the circular in a different format that was sent to Canada on July 30th for their information. Well, the Postmaster General says, look, if you want to do service, mail service with England, with the United States, maybe we can do airmail with England, maybe we can do surface mail with the United States. And he proposed the creation of a draft postal circular. And this is what it looked like. And when you look at this circular, it looks like the British circular, mail service to Palestine. The rates and the reference to the fact that there is no mail going to areas under Arab control. And then Turnbull says, we just heard from the United States, they're happy to take our mail to Palestine by surface, by land, or by sea. So the Postmaster General says, okay, I'm going to go and create another postal circular, mail service to Palestine. Again, no mail going to areas of Arab control, surface mail, air mail. And there's the 25% letter rate that I talked about with the Daltrop letter at the early part of the conversation. So it's July the 28th, 1948, and there's a briefing note prepared by External Affairs and a response to the Postmaster General that Lester Pearson was supposed to read and adopt, and it says, the letter will not fully recognize Israel. So here is a letter signed by Lester Pearson, the Under-Secretary of State for External Affairs, talking about how the postal circular that Mr. Turnbull was drafting had to be changed in parts because of the concerns about recognizing Jerusalem, recognizing the state of Israel, not referring to the state of Israel. Pearson then writes a letter to London, and he's furious. And he said, you guys in the United Kingdom, you double-crossed us because you told us that you weren't going to establish postal communications exclusively for the Jewish area of Palestine. And we're surprised to learn you've acted in a manner contradictory to what you've told us, without adequate information. So then he writes to Turnbull, the Postmaster General, and says, you can tell the UK that we'll have some mail service with the United Kingdom, with Palestine, but airmail will go through the United Kingdom, surface mail will go through the United States, and there won't be any registered mail. But what's so shocking here, that's found in the Department of External Affairs file, is that Lester Pearson, through Mr. Riddell, writes to Mr. Ignatieff at the United Nations and is warning him that you better not be able to trust the UK entirely, because what they did was they crossed us up with respect to postal communications with Palestine. So you better watch out as to how they deal on other questions concerning Palestine. In other words, what Canada didn't want to do is to be caught out if the United Kingdom recognized Israel before Canada did and without telling Canada. So Robertson, from the High Commissioner in London, writes back to Lester Pearson in a secret memorandum. And he said, don't worry, here's a copy of the secret memorandum. Secret, secret, all over it. And by the way, here's over on the left side, seen by LBP, seen by Lester Pearson, Lester B. Pearson, by A.A. Day, and some of the other people, Mr. Reed, Mr. Mayrand, and other people to whom I've referred to. And it's a secret communication, and he said, you know, those government officials, you know, they make mistakes all the time. We can blame them. But what's very interesting is the British tell the Canadians that they made an offer to both the Arabs and the Jews for joint mail service, or consecutive mail service, or concurrent mail service is probably the best word. And the Arabs weren't ready in the circumstances, and Jordan wasn't ready, so they decided to go ahead dealing with communications in Jewish-controlled areas. Very interesting. And in this memorandum from the United Kingdom, from the High Commissioner in London, he said, don't worry, we won't put you out where the UK authorities will recognize the provisional government of Israel without telling you. Mr. Bevan, remember, who worked for Mr. Attlee as the Foreign Secretary, has said in the British House of Commons that the government in the UK hasn't changed its policies, and the Commonwealth Relations Office assured us the government won't contemplate a move without informing us in advance. So he said, and by the way, you know, not much is really going to happen for the next few months anyway, because there's conflict between Arabs and Jews, the mediators in there, and we think there's going to be a period of relative calm. Well, then the Commonwealth Relations Department in London writes to Pearson and to Riddell and tells them the same things. So Pearson says, okay, let's decide what we're going to do here and get this postal circular out. They flesh out the postal circular in Canada with more detail. Air mail will go through England, surface mail will go through the United States. July the 30th, here's an expanded draft of the postal circular. They still say that arrangements to other parts of Palestine, notice there's no reference to Arab-controlled anymore. It just says other parts of Palestine, because they've adopted the postal offices from the Jewish-controlled areas for surface mail and for air mail. So, and I'll skip this one. So what we have is August the 7th, 1948, the postal circular comes out. And here it is, what I showed you at the outset of the presentation, mail service to Palestine. That's why it says what it does. That's why the format is what it is, showing you how politics shape the creation and formatting in these circulars. But it becomes even more interesting because Israel then reacts on August the 3rd to the fact that Canada is going to issue a postal circular. Israel says, we're grateful, but by the way, you know, we've already got postal relationship with another 35 countries, and we're hoping that you'll support us for the Universal Postal Union. And it says, well, I do not intend communicating direct with Palestine. It is assumed your department sees no objection in sending notices to the Universal Postal Union. So what Canada would do is communicate about mail to Palestine through the Universal Postal Union, not with Israel directly, not with referring to Israel whatsoever. And Pearson then goes and is given this response about the fact, you will no doubt agree that the Canadian government or any of its departments may not properly send communications to the Postmaster of Israel. Now, why was Canada taking this position in August of 1948? And remember, this is Lester B. Pearson, and he says, I am in full agreement that until a decision has been taken on Canadian recognition of Israel, it would be improper for us, Canada, to reply directly directly to the Postmaster General of Israel. And he says you're only to send communications about mail to Palestine through the Universal Postal Union, who will then go and tell Palestine what we wrote. So this is Pearson talking to the Swiss about a rejection of Canada's support for Israel's entry into the Universal Postal Union. Now, what then happens? Israel then has relationships with Great Britain, and there's mail going between Israel and Great Britain, air mail. And here's an example of it for the first flight going from Israel to Great Britain. And there's other mail that's going. The postal rate probably should be 40 rather than 25, but mail is starting up between Israel and Great Britain. Here's double weight mail, 2 times weight going to England, commercial mail, and it's censored, as you'll see. And then there's single weight mail going by airmail. There's a beautiful tab on one of the Israel stamps. There's the censorship marking from Israel, censorship tape over on the side. And here's mail, interestingly, going from London to Palestine. And remember, postal relations have already started. They started on the 23rd of July. And yet, it says, return to sender, no service. So even the postal services in the UK and in Palestine, as far as Great Britain saw it, weren't sure that mail would get through everywhere. And there was a concern, perhaps, that Jaffa was considered to be an Arab-controlled area, even though it was in fact controlled by Israel since May of 1948. We have other mail that goes from England to Israel, but it's not accepted. And it's not accepted because the sender wanted to send it by registered mail, and there was no registered mail service at the time in August of 1948. So why do things actually change? What's behind all this? And this is one of the most important slides in this whole deck. Louis Saint Laurent becomes the liberal leader in August of 1948. Pearson becomes the Secretary of State in September of 48. Scott Reed becomes the Undersecretary. And by the way, in order to become the Secretary of State, Lester Pearson had to get elected to the House of Commons. So he went and ran in Algoma East in Ontario in what was generally considered to be a safe Liberal seat, and was elected in late October of 1948. King falls ill, and Saint Laurent becomes the Prime Minister even earlier than a projected takeover of the role from November 15. Why are all these facts important? Because now you can see why the circular read the way it did. Because King was still in control. Pearson was concerned about becoming Secretary of State for External Affairs at the time, and there was no guarantee that he would be put in that position by King. Paul Martin, who ultimately became Prime Minister of Canada, was considered one of the favorites for the position at the time to become Secretary of State for External Affairs. Pearson wanted to get elected to the House of Commons because he couldn't be Secretary of State unless he was elected. So he was trying to keep a low profile on the whole Palestine matter at the time. So when the circular is being drafted in late July, early August of 1948, these people, Saint Laurent and Pearson, are keeping a low profile relative to what was going on. What else is happening in the world that ultimately mollifies the liberal position? Cold War tensions, Soviet blockades in Berlin. The U.S. is concerned about a world war with the Soviet Union. Pearson is becoming identified with what was becoming a failed partition plan from the UNSCOP that we talked about earlier in late 1947. So he was muted about expressing a view about Canadian foreign policy. King was still the Prime Minister, as I mentioned, committed to the state of action. Now, since September of 1948, and Count Bernadotte, the UN mediator, is proposing a different plan than the partition plan. And under this plan, the Jewish state is in the orange, as you see, and then Bernadotte comes up with a second plan where a lot of the territory is considered to be Arab territory, with very little territory going to the Jewish state. And what happens? Radical groups in Israel, whom the paper calls Jewish irregulars, murder Bernadotte. They assassinate him. And so he's killed in Palestine at the time. His car is ambushed. He's killed. The Stern Group is the group of Jews who were the renegade group who killed him. But what's happening in the conflict in the meantime? Israel starts taking more and more territory from the Arabs. They take the Negev, they take the Upper Galilee, and Bernadotte's partition mediation report is not adopted because the U.S. has taken the position it doesn't want to adopt that as Israel takes more and more territory in Palestine, and others are taking a strong position. So what happens between Canada and Palestine after August of 1948? Limited postal services, some progressive additions of services to Jewish-controlled areas. Arab-controlled areas get postal services. So here's a letter from Israel to Montreal. Not enough postage, beautiful postage dues that are imposed. Letter is censored, and it's sent actually, if you look at the back of the letter, by a soldier in the Israeli army. And it's sent through the military post in Israel, something that necessarily wasn't supposed to be reflected on correspondence so advertently. The postal circulars are starting to be redrafted, but Canada's still referring to mail service to Palestine. Even though it's after August 7th, 1948, there are new circulars that are put out, more and more services, more and more airmail, but Canada still doesn't have registered mail with Palestine. So this is Israel to Montreal. It's sent by registered mail out of Safed in northern Israel, and it says in Hebrew that it's being returned for no service because there wasn't registered mail. And here's mail out of Canada, a routine first aid cover, which has the 25-cent airmail rate that I talked about before. It goes from Vancouver, October 1st, 1948, and it lands in Haifa by air of October 20th, 1948. So airmail is working. Mail service to Palestine extends. Here are the Arab areas of Palestine where service is being sent to. And here are the postal rates. The postal rates are being expanded. The services are being expanded, but there's still no registered mail or parcel post. And then Canada initiates registration for surface mail, but only to Jewish areas, not for airmail, not for Arab-controlled areas, no parcel post. So you see that Canada progressively is adding services to Palestine, but still calls it mail service to Palestine. We have Canada to Israel. Here's a letter coming out of Calgary, 15 cents, it should have been 25. Beautiful Israel postage dues being put on, very hard to find a postage due, the first postage due with a tab. The tabs of the postage dues didn't have any writing on them. November 6, 48 occurs. Parcels are now being contemplated by Canada, but still not being sent. And then the UK is still communicating. And the UK is now telling Canada everything. Oh, we're going to do this with Palestine. We're communicating with Jordan, but they don't want us to do certain things. So I'm going to quickly move through this because the UK is extending service and telling Canada about all the service. So Canada, not surprisingly, is happy to extend service because its counterparts in the UK are expanding service to Palestine. So Arab-controlled areas, surface mail, air mail, and so there are different postal circulars that are coming out. And here's an example of something that happened not on an infrequent basis. Here's a letter going from England to Israel, but it gets intercepted in Egypt. And there's an Egyptian censor marking, and it ultimately ends up in Palestine or in Israel months later. But it was sent September, it gets there in October, but it was first seized through by the Egyptians at the time. So more and more services occurring. Here's an example of still no registration. Here's a letter from Manchester to Tel Aviv, returned to sender because there is no registration service that's permitted. Now the UPU in November, December 1948 doesn't talk about the new state of Israel. It talks about the territory of Israel. I don't know what's going on here, but no one's really sure of what's going on until December the 24th, 1948. Saint Laurent officially becomes Prime Minister on November 15th. Pearson goes and talks to the UN General Assembly. The UN Security Council rejects Israel's application for admission to the UN. Canada votes against, or Canada abstains actually, and the Great Britain votes against. De facto recognition of the State of Israel occurs December 24th. Why did Canada move on de facto December 24th, 1948? Pearson was reading the tea leaves. Saint Laurent was now the Prime Minister. He was installed as the Minister of External Affairs. He had been talking to the UK, who he thought would now recognize Israel on a de facto basis. Canada didn't want to extend UN recognition to Israel at the time, so it just went on a de facto basis. So here's a letter still marked to Palestine, Israel. You know, you play both sides of the coin. You know, you hedge your bets as to what it'll be. But it's a letter out of Canada, only postmarked with 15 cents, postage due, applied in Israel. And now we're back to the Daltrop letter. And you see how now, historically, it's so important. Because this was one of the first letters to travel to Israel after Israel had been extended de facto recognition by Canada on December the 24th, Christmas Eve. This is going day after Boxing Day to Jerusalem. It was addressed to Jerusalem, Palestine, but it actually was going to Israel. And what's so embarrassing for the Liberal government, now that you see the archival material, the Postmaster General writes a very funny, in hindsight, communication to Pearson. And he says, I've observed in the press that Canada now recognizes the State of Israel on a de facto basis and the authority of the provisional government. We haven't been communicating with anyone at the time, basically because you told us not to. So may I inquire whether de facto recognition cancels the understanding there would be no direct communications? And can we now do parcel post service? And can we communicate directly? And this is December the 28th, December the 31st. And Pearson, under his, as Secretary of State, with Escott Reed now acting as the Undersecretary, says, okay, now you can go and communicate directly, just like we do with everybody else who's a member of the Universal Postal Union. And what's so ironic about this is Canada didn't support the application of Israel into the Universal Postal Union, and that didn't occur until the end of 1949. So we're quickly in 1949, as I'll get close to the end here, and now all sorts of countries are recognizing Israel on a de facto basis. The UK, France, or at least the cabinet on a de facto basis recognized Israel in the UK. There's armistices that are now occurring with Egypt, for example. Israel holds its first election and its government is formally elected by its people. New Zealand announces de facto recognition, so does Australia. The UK is announcing de facto recognition again on January 30th. The US legally recognizes Israel and Jordan, you'll see, at the same time, because that was part of the deal with the United Kingdom. There's armistice with Israel. The UK announces registered mail service to Palestine. Israel creates an armistice with Jordan. NATO, isn't this interesting that all the countries come together because this was part of the deal and everybody signed up for NATO after all of these different events had occurred. And on April of 49, UN Security Council recommends Israel to the UN. Syria's armistice occurs. Israel's admitted into the UPU. And then the UK in 1950 recognizes on a legal basis the State of Israel. So here is the recognition of the State of Israel by the Postmaster General. He's going and saying there's no objection to going and recognizing Israel. And then the first circular comes out in January, February, and mail is now going to Israel. Here's a letter going to Israel. There are references, the first references to the State of Israel by Canada in January of 1949. Parcel post occurs, more circulars talking about Canada and Israel, and there's registered mail going to the Arab-controlled areas. So more and more as time's going on, the file of external affairs recognizes everything. But Canada delays on UN recognition. It abstains in December of 1948. It approves the UN application in March of 1949. Other countries vote in favor of Israel, 37 to 12, 9 abstentions. Canada did vote in favor. Different countries did not. And then we have the UK, the UPU, and this is the shocking material in the External Affairs file in the archives where Pearson tells the Swiss, we're not going to recognize Israel under any circumstances for the reasons I've expressed. So, and there's material in the file how the Egyptians imposed on Canada. Basically the Egyptians came to Canada and said, we're asking you to reject the Universal Postal Union application of Israel, which Canada did follow. And I'm just going to quickly move through things right now and finish off here. There's the December 1949 acceptance of the UPU. I mentioned the Red Cross. This is the correspondence with the Red Cross, where Canada said, we don't need your help in delivering mails to POWs because we have mail service. So Britain ends up creating mail service with Israel finally in 1949. There is still reference in mail to Palestine. And the last thing I want to point out is now you know why it's a 60-year anniversary for the friendship, because Canada really didn't support the Universal Postal Union or the UN until sometime mid to late 1949. That is the presentation. I'm sorry I tried to bring it in an hour and a half, and I think I did joke. So I'm happy to take questions in the circumstances. I know it was a whirlwind tour, but I'll stop sharing my screen.
So that was a whirlwind tour. But you see why you need the history in order to understand contextually the postal information. So this was a talk that combined social history, you know, as we would normally refer to it, and philately, to get to a place where we see when we read a postal circular from the UK, from Canada, from the United States, why these circulars read the way they did. And you would have no idea about all the fuss that went on behind the scenes. And what's so shocking to me, you know, in these kinds of studies, is to find out that when we're just looking at our postal history and our postal rates and our routes and our markings, how people who had no knowledge of philately, who had no knowledge of stamps, spent so much time worrying about what was said to the postmasters, to the collectors. But the average person coming up and wanting to put stamps on a letter to Palestine might be able to, might not be able to. The person might have addressed it to Israel. It wouldn't have gone to Israel until a particular point in time. There had to be some specific service that was available or was not available. So it's a fascinating story, and I really thank you all for coming and for sharing it with me. There's probably many stories like this that are out there, and I welcome you all to find them, you know, in whatever area of philately you engage in. Questions?
I was hoping that had Pearson been involved earlier in the process, that it might have been a different outcome. But it seems that...
No, not at all.
No.
Pearson, I think what's so shocking is that Pearson's personal ambitions were very much at play. He needed to get elected to the House of Commons. He wanted to become Secretary of State. Ultimately, some of you may or may not know that ultimately Pearson tried to be Secretary General of the United Nations, and he wasn't successful in doing that because there wasn't political alignment that permitted that.
Interesting.
But Pearson's political ambitions really manifested themselves at the height of, or really at the last juncture of King's prime ministership, where he was still trying to keep the relationship with Great Britain solid and stable with respect to Palestine. So because of these things, I think what we see is Pearson not doing anything, Saint Laurent not doing anything, because the Liberal convention for him to be elected as or not to be elected, to be appointed the Liberal leader was August the 7th. And the circular was coming out on August the 8th, actually released the beginning of August. So all of these personal factors really stopped these politicians from referring to Israel. And particularly because Count Bernadotte was conducting the mediation for the United Nations between the Arabs and the Jews, and Canada, having a seat on the Security Council, didn't want to be seen as politically favoring Israel in the circumstances by extending recognition, even though they had a legal opinion that de facto recognition of Israel wouldn't amount to formal recognition of Israel. So the archives file was fascinating, but I was only able to contextually put it together after a lot of work, both looking at the history, looking at the philately, and looking at the people. So that's why I enjoyed doing this a great deal. And you know, this is what makes this hobby so fantastic. You know, truly. Linda.
Okay, I'm a non-collector.
Yeah.
You all probably know the answer to this. But when the letters were sent to Israel and there was no longer service, and so it went in dead mail, would that dead mail at some point later be delivered, or was it just destroyed or lost, or?
Depended. If it went to the dead letter office, it likely just sat there, and how some of the stuff ever got out of the dead letter office. We have some exhibits on the floor dealing with dead letter mail, and I've always wondered how it always got out to collectors. Sometimes it was returned to sender, and then it was resent, you know, when service actually came about again. Sometimes it was sent by courier. And by courier, I'm not talking FedEx, you know, for example. People would go to France, they'd go to Czechoslovakia, somebody would be saying, can you take this mail with you, and then mail it from there. So there were couriers that came over, Cyprus, Czechoslovakia, Air France started landing in Israel in June of '48. So that's how some mail got there, if it was rejected at some points.
Would they be more likely to have sent it back to the sender? Like now, we get letters sent back if you have a wrong address,
Yeah,
or whatever, or go to dead mail. They just send
It depended. You saw, I gave some examples of mail that was returned to sender. They tried to return it to sender, and they didn't have a return address, or the sender might have said, I don't want to pay postage due, you know, so it just went on there. So it really depended, you know, on what the rules and regulations were and the circumstances under which the mail was resent. That's good questions. That's a philatelist question.
You had several really good examples of postage due stamps. You know, from my perspective, anyway, I see postage due stamps in stamp albums. You very, very rarely actually see them on cover being used and for the purpose that they were created.
Yeah, Andrew Chung, the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada, has an exhibit out there on postage dues, Canadian postage dues. He, I believe, has some examples, and he's written a book on Canadian postage dues. I mean, you do see them. Those I always found quite attractive. You know, those early postage, the Canadian, I call them early Canadian postage dues, and finding them on mail with Palestine is not that common. We don't see it very much. Sometimes you'll see Palestine postage dues on mail from Canada, you know, as opposed to the other way around that I've shown. So it's good. I mean, the postage due cover that I showed that I really like a lot was in April of 1948, so it's right when services were being terminated. And I've always found it a good transition piece to show a transition from the British mandate into the provisional government piece, State of Israel piece. So it's always a nice piece.
Cool stuff.
Other questions?
I just have two quick things to add. First,
Sure.
in all my years of studying this, I've never seen something as narrowly focused, meaning Canada-Israel, during that 47 to 1949, 50 era that ties together all of what was going on geopolitically throughout the globe, as well as, you know, the postal communication recognition things that you've raised here. And it is definitely a footprint not only for Israel, but also just what was going on during that moment in history with a lot of nations outside of Israel that were starting after World War II to emerge. So it probably is such a historical study that you've done, well beyond just Canada and Israel, which leads me to this sort of my question, and that is, the other Commonwealth nations, did they follow the same pattern as Canada?
It's a good question, and I was going to, in the PowerPoint, deal with a bit of that. I started to, when I referred to Australia and New Zealand,
Yeah.
I was going to put a piece I have that's a Dora Ivry piece that goes to New Zealand from Israel, where registration didn't exist between Israel and New Zealand, so the piece did go, but it just said no registration at the time. Some other Commonwealth countries really pushed back very hard. Australia on the UK. The UK wanted to hold Australia, New Zealand, and some other Commonwealth countries at bay, voting in favor of Israel going into the UN. I believe, but I wouldn't confirm this, that Australia, for example, was a proponent of trying to push UN recognition for Israel at a fairly early stage. I believe New Zealand was as well. Mm-hmm. And the UK just said, look, you got to hold off till we get our act together, and we do it together, because UK wanted to, in effect, control what the outcome would be for the Commonwealth countries. You know, driving a lot of this, because there were relationships with the Arab countries over oil, and that was something that was at play with Great Britain. You know, Great Britain was in Iraq, for example, and so there were interests that needed to be protected. Bahrain, you know, another country in the region. So I think all these geopolitical factors were really important in deciding how these things were going to be done. See, I thought one of the most interesting things I found when I was doing the archival work was that Canada was put into the space where it had to deal with these things because Israel pushed them on it, because they sent the recognition telegram, or telex. They sent the Postmaster General recognition telex. And as a result, Canada had to create a response. Otherwise, I don't know if Canada would have done anything for a period of time in the circumstances, especially given the political climate and the personal political climates that I was describing. So that's why all of this coming together is very interesting, you know, in the circumstances. It also shows you when you find mail in dealers' boxes, you never know how significant they are historically, let alone philatelically. You might look at something and say it's a junky cover and it's a very low rate and it's a common rate, and who cares? And you might find the addressee is important, or the person who's addressing is important. Anyway.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you,
First of all, I
Les.
must commend you for an incredible presentation.
Thank you very much.
Would you publish this in a publication, in a book?
I haven't decided what I'm going to do with this yet, you know, in terms of whether or not it's going to be an article. I know Michael's going to at least write up a little summary of it when he's doing his Capex 22 article for the Israel Philatelist. But, you know, whether or not I put it into a little monograph as is with some adjustments I need to make, because I always spot things I need to correct whenever I do this, remains to be seen.
I would recommend.
Oh, well, thank you, Les. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
Steve, why don't you come in?
Yeah, it's back. Flash go?
Yes.